The sun over Redemption Gulch was a merciless hammer, beating down on the dusty Main Street and bleaching the life from everything it touched. A crowd had gathered, a restless sea of sweat-stained hats and faded calico dresses, their faces a mixture of grim duty and morbid curiosity. In the center of it all stood the gallows, a stark, skeletal frame of freshly cut pine against the pale blue sky. On the platform, Nita stood straight and unflinching. Her hands were bound behind her back, the rough rope chafing her skin, but her chin was held high. Her long, black hair, usually tied back, was loose and stirred by the hot, dry breeze. She was Apache, and in this town, in these times, that was a crime in itself. The official charge was the murder of a prospector, a flimsy accusation built on her being found near his camp. No proof, just prejudice. Her dark eyes swept over the crowd, not with pleading, but with a silent, burning condemnation that made some of the townsfolk shuffle their feet and look away. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was dwarfed by his sweat-soaked collar, read the verdict with a trembling voice, the paper shaking in his hand. Beside him, Jedediah Kane, the cattle baron whose land bordered everything and everyone, watched with a smug, satisfied smirk. It was his word that had sealed her fate, his influence that had whipped the town into this righteous frenzy. He wanted the Apache lands, and a public hanging was a good way to send a message. "Let's get on with it, Sheriff." A voice yelled from the crowd, and a chorus of eager agreements followed. Brody cleared his throat, wiped his brow with the back of his hand, and placed the noose around Nita's neck. She didn't flinch, her gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. The air grew thick and still. The creak of the rope was the only sound. Brody looked at Kane, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The sheriff raised his hand, ready to give the signal. Then a new sound cut through the tension. The slow, rhythmic clopping of a single horse. Heads turned. At the far end of the street, a lone rider emerged from the heat haze. He wasn't riding fast, but every step of his horse seemed to command the space around it. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached, a silent wave before a steady prow. He came to a halt 50 feet from the gallows, his horse snorting in the dust. The man, weathered and anonymous in the harsh light, simply sat there, his gaze locked on the sheriff. The hand that was about to fall froze in midair. The silence stretched, thin and brittle. Elias Thorne swung a leg over his saddle, his movements unhurried, deliberate. The soft thud of his boots hitting the dusty street was the only sound, each step toward the gallows a drumbeat marking a shift in the town's tense rhythm. He didn't look at the crowd, his gaze fixed on the man with the tin star. "Sheriff," Elias' voice was low, yet it carried across the square with the clarity of a church bell. "A public hanging is a heavy business. You certain you've got all your facts straight?" Sheriff Brody flinched, his hand hovering near his pistol. "The court found her guilty, Thorne. The evidence was presented. It's the law." His words lacked conviction, a weak shield against Elias' steady stare. Before Brody could crumble further, Jedediah Kane stepped forward, his face a mask of thunderous rage. "Who the hell are you to question the law in this town? This Apache killed a good man, and she's gonna hang for it. This ain't your concern." Elias finally turned his head, meeting Kane's glare without a flicker of intimidation. "Murder is every decent man's concern, Kane. I heard Jacob was stabbed in the back, a big man like him." He gestured with his chin toward the gallows. "You're telling this town that she," he said, pointing to Nita, who watched him with a flicker of disbelief in her stoic eyes, overpowered a man twice her size and drove a blade clean through him. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was a detail they hadn't considered, a loose thread in the story they'd all accepted. Elias pressed his advantage, his voice cutting through the growing uncertainty. "And the knife, the one that did the deed, did anyone find it? Or did it just vanish into thin air?" He let the question hang, a direct challenge not just to Kane, but to the entire town's rush to judgment. Men who had been shouting for blood now looked at each other, their certainty wavering. Sheriff Brody swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the unmovable rancher and the furious cattle baron. The noose still dangled over Nita's head, but for the first time since dawn, It seemed justice might not be so simple. Cain's face turned a deep, blotchy red, his rage boiling over. "Seize him," he roared, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. "String 'em both up. I'll not be made a fool of in my own town." Two of Cain's hired hands, burly men with cold eyes, moved forward, their hands dropping to the pistols on their hips. The crowd gasped, stepping back as the air crackled with the promise of violence. Nita, still on the platform, watched Elias, a flicker of something unreadable in her dark eyes. But before Cain's men could reach him, Sheriff Brody made his move. It wasn't a heroic charge, but a clumsy, desperate shuffle that placed him directly between Elias and the advancing men. "Hold on now, Jedediah." Brody's voice was thin but firm, amplified by the sudden silence. "This is still a town of law. We can't just have a shootout in the street because you're angry." He looked from Cain's furious face to Elias' calm one. He was a man caught in a vice, and for the first time, he chose to push back against the pressure from the cattle baron. Elias seized the moment Brody's intervention had bought him. He didn't raise his voice, yet it carried across the square with chilling clarity. "The sheriff is right. You want justice. Then you need to look for real evidence." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle before continuing. "The man you should be looking for left a trail. I found it this morning, north of here, along Black Creek." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Black Creek was miles away, a rugged, isolated area. Cain scoffed, "Lies, a desperate trick to save this savage." He caught himself, realizing he was losing the crowd's sentiment with his blind fury. "Is it?" Elias challenged, his gaze unwavering. His horse threw a shoe near the crossing, a specific kind with a nick on the left side, and near the bank, half buried in the mud, "That's where you'll find the knife that killed Jacob Smith, not with her." He nodded towards Nita. The detail was too specific to be a simple bluff. It was a direct, verifiable claim. Now, refusing to investigate would look like an admission of a flawed prosecution. Cain was trapped. With a snarl of frustration, he glared at Brody. "Fine, you have 24 hours. Find this knife. If you don't, she hangs at dawn tomorrow. And you," he spat at Elias, "you'll be right beside her." Brody, looking both relieved and terrified, quickly had Nita escorted back to the jail. Her execution stayed, for now. The sun beat down relentlessly as the three riders left the dusty streets of Redemption Gulch behind. Elias Thorne rode at the head, his expression unreadable, leading them toward the scrubland that bordered Black Creek. Behind him, Sheriff Brody's face was a mask of weary conflict, his gaze shifting between Elias and the third rider, a burly, scowling man named Cobb, Jedediah Cain's most loyal enforcer. Cobb made no secret of his disdain. "You're wasting our time, Thorne," Cobb grumbled, his horse kicking up dust. Cain was right. This is a fool's errand. There ain't nothing out here but snakes and rocks. Elias didn't turn. "Patience, Cobb. The truth isn't always found on the main road." Sheriff Brody remained silent, but he watched Elias closely. The rancher moved with a quiet confidence that was unnerving. He wasn't just riding, he was reading the land, his eyes scanning every indentation in the dry earth. Brody had spent a career taking the easy path laid out by Cain, and now this stranger was forcing him down a trail he couldn't predict. "You're mighty certain of what we'll find," Brody said, his voice raspy. "I'm certain of what I saw," Elias replied simply. After another hour, they reached the muddy banks of Black Creek. The air was heavy and still. Elias dismounted, his boots sinking slightly into the soft ground. The tracks were here, near the water's edge, where someone might stop to wash their hands. Cobb snorted, staying mounted. Or where a coyote stopped for a drink. Elias ignored him, slowly walking the perimeter. His focus was absolute. Within minutes, he stopped and knelt. "Sheriff!" Brody dismounted and approached. There, clear as day in a patch of dried mud, was a horseshoe print. And just as Elias had described, one side of it was distinctly chipped. Brody's breath caught in his throat. It was real. "A lucky guess," Cobb spat, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Is it?" Elias said, his eyes scanning the surrounding reeds. He reached into a thicket, his hand closing around something solid. He pulled it out, mud and water dripping from the object. It was a large hunting knife, its bone handle carved with a distinctive K. The bloodstain on the blade was faint but unmistakable. Cobb stared, his face paling. He knew that knife. Everyone who worked for Jedediah Kane knew that knife. Sheriff Brody looked from the weapon to Cobb's stunned face, and the cold, hard reality of the situation finally settled in his gut like a lead weight. The ride back to Redemption Gulch was a silent one, heavy with the weight of the discovered knife. Sheriff Brody held the weapon wrapped in a cloth, its handle a constant, damning presence. His jaw was set. The easy compliance he once showed Jedediah Kane burned away by a cold, hard fury. Fury at himself for his blindness, and at the man who had nearly made him a party to murder. Beside him, Cobb rode with the posture of a condemned man, his eyes wide, and darting between the sheriff and the impassive Elias Thorne. He looked like a cornered animal, torn between loyalty to his ruthless employer and the stark reality of the gallows he had helped build for another. Elias, for his part, remained stoic, his gaze fixed on the town ahead, his presence a silent promise that this would be seen through to the end. As they entered the main street, a hush fell over the remaining crowd. All eyes turned to the three riders. Nita, still standing on the gallows platform under the watch of two deputies, lifted her head. Her expression was unreadable, but for the first time in hours, the rigid line of her shoulders seemed to soften just a fraction. Hope was a dangerous thing, but the sight of the sheriff riding with such grim purpose was impossible to ignore. Kane, who had been holding court on the saloon porch, pushed himself off a post, his face a mask of impatience. Brody dismounted without a word, his boots kicking up dust as he strode directly toward the cattle baron. He didn't stop until he was inches from Kane, the town watching in breathless silence. He unwrapped the knife and held it up, the afternoon sun glinting off the steel blade and the crudely carved K on the handle. "We found this at Black Creek, Jedediah." Brody's voice was low but carried in the stillness. "Right where Elias said it would be." Kane's confident smirk faltered. He stared at the knife, a flicker of recognition followed by a wave of cold fury. He scoffed, trying to regain control. "And some drifter plants a knife and you come running back like a spooked coyote. This is a trick." He jabbed a finger toward Elias. "He's trying to frame me," but his denial lacked conviction. It was the bluster of a man caught off guard. Brody didn't flinch. His gaze was like iron. "Is that so?" he said, turning his head just enough to pin Cobb with a stare. "Because your man Cobb here seemed to recognize it just fine." All eyes swung to Cobb, who visibly paled and shrank under the collective scrutiny. Brody turned back to Kane, his voice now ringing with the authority he had so long abdicated. "The hanging is off. Nita is to be released. This is now a murder investigation, Jedediah, and it starts with you." A heavy silence fell over the square, broken only by the wind whistling past the gallows. Jedediah Kane's face, once a mask of smug authority, was now contorted with a mixture of disbelief and raw fury. His power, built on fear and intimidation, had evaporated in a matter of seconds. Sheriff Brody didn't give him a chance to recover. "Deputy," he called out, his voice sharp and clear, "get that rope off her." The deputy, who had been frozen in place, hurried to comply. He fumbled with the knot, his hands shaking, before finally pulling the thick, rough noose from around Nita's neck. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes finding Elias across the dusty square. For the first time, a flicker of something other than defiance showed in her expression, profound, weary relief. Elias moved through the parting crowd, his focus entirely on her. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze gentle. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he simply nodded, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement. "It's not over yet," he said, his voice low and steady, meant only for her, "but you are safe." Nita met his gaze, her own nod conveying a gratitude too deep for words. She stood taller, rubbing the raw skin on her neck, no longer a prisoner but a survivor. "This is a farce, Brody," Kane roared, finding his voice at last. "You're taking the word of a drifter over mine? This town answers to me." But the threat rang hollow. The crowd, once his loyal audience, now looked at him with suspicion and fear. They weren't afraid of him anymore, they were afraid of what he'd done. Brody ignored him, turning his attention to the trembling figure of Cobb. "You're under arrest," Brody stated, grabbing Cobb's arm. Cobb flinched, expecting the worst. "For your own protection," Brody added, shoving him toward the jail. "You're the key witness, and you're going to tell us everything." Seeing his leverage disappear into a cell, Kane's face turned purple with rage. He pointed a trembling finger at Elias. You'll regret this, both of you." With that final, venomous promise, he turned and stormed toward his ranch house, his retreat a stark admission of defeat. The crowd began to disperse, muttering amongst themselves, leaving Elias, Nita, and Sheriff Brody in the quiet square. The shadow of the gallows still loomed, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like justice might finally see the light of day. The night air in Redemption Gulch hung thick with unspoken threats. Inside the sheriff's office, the glow of a single lantern cast long, dancing shadows. Brody stood guard by the door, shotgun in hand, while Elias cleaned his revolver at the desk. Nita, no longer a prisoner, watched the street through the grimy window, her expression unreadable. In the back, Cobb shivered in his cell, a man caught between a vengeful boss and the hangman's noose. Suddenly, the night erupted. A volley of gunfire shattered the window, sending glass flying. "Get down," Brody yelled, as he and Elias returned fire into the darkness. Kane had come for his witness. Pinned behind the desk, Elias saw figures moving in the alleyway. "They're trying to flank us. We can't hold them off for long." While the men were locked in a desperate firefight at the front, Nita saw Kane himself creeping along the side of the building, a lit torch in his hand. He was aiming for a weak spot in the wooden wall near Cobb's cell, intending to burn them out. Without a word, she slipped out the back door, melting into the shadows she knew so well. As Kane raised the torch, a stone, thrown with pinpoint accuracy, struck his wrist. He cried out in pain, dropping the flame, which sputtered and died in the dirt. He spun around, pistol drawn, but Nita was already on him. She moved not like a victim, but like a predator, using her momentum to drive her shoulder hard into his chest. Kane stumbled back, losing his balance and crashing into a horse trough. Before he could recover, the cold steel of Elias' revolver pressed against his temple. "It's over, Jedediah." With their leader captured, his face a mask of shock and fury, Kane's remaining men quickly surrendered. The attempted siege had failed spectacularly. The next morning, a new sun rose over Redemption Gulch. Jedediah Kane occupied the very cell he had built for Nita, his power irrevocably broken. Sheriff Brody, his integrity restored, stood taller, addressing the townsfolk with newfound authority. As the dust settled, Elias turned to Nita. "My ranch, it's quiet. There's work if you want it. A place to start over." Nita looked at him, her eyes holding a strength that had never wavered. A small, genuine smile touched her lips for the first time. "I would like that," she said. Together, they mounted their horses and rode out of town, leaving the shadows of Redemption Gulch behind for the promise of a shared horizon.